In September 1683, the city of Vienna faced its darkest hour. Rising beyond its walls was one of the largest armies Europe had seen in centuries, the vast host of the Ottoman Empire. Tens of thousands marched under the crescent banner, their goal clear: to push deep into Central Europe and break open the gates of Christendom. Against such overwhelming force, only a fragile alliance dared to resist. At its heart stood John III Sobieski, a king of Poland, a commander whose courage and tactical brilliance would soon turn the tide of history. This was no ordinary siege. It was a struggle for survival, a moment where strategy, faith, and sheer determination would decide the fate of an entire continent. The summer of 1683 was thick with anxiety across Central Europe. Whispers of war spread like wildfire. Merchants along the Danube spoke of caravans of soldiers, of countless tents rising in the Balkans, and of a sultan's will driving his empire westward once again. At first, many dismissed the rumors as tales grown from fear. Yet soon, undeniable reports arrived. Villages emptied, churches reduced to ash, farmland stripped bare, and armies on the march. By June, all illusions had vanished. The Ottoman Empire was moving once more against Vienna. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha commanded a force unmatched in both size and variety. The sheer bulk of the army slowed its advance, yet its progress was inevitable, like a tide sweeping across the land. From Edirne through the Balkans, towns that resisted were obliterated. Those that surrendered were spared, but only in exchange for provisions, men, and submission. By July, the Ottoman banners were already visible on Austria's borders. Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg dynasty, was no ordinary city. Its walls and bastions were formidable, its moats deep. But inside, defenses were fragile. On July 7th, Emperor Leopold I, fearing capture, abandoned the city and fled west to Linz. Many nobles followed, leaving behind barely 15,000 professional soldiers and about 5,000 citizen militia to defend the capital. Responsibility for the defense fell to Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, a commander of Iron Will, though only 36 years old. His task was monumental: to hold Vienna against the mightiest army in the world long enough for help to arrive. On July 14th, the Ottoman vanguard appeared. By the 17th, Vienna was encircled. The plains outside transformed into a sea of silk tents stretching for miles, a second city that dwarfed the one under siege. At its center rose Kara Mustafa's luxurious pavilion, adorned with carpets and fountains, a palace of comfort and arrogance, facing the battered, anxious walls of Vienna. Confident of victory, the Grand Vizier believed he would not need to storm the city's defenses. He intended to starve Vienna into submission, breaking its will with hunger and despair rather than sacrifice his army in a costly assault. As July turned to August, the siege began in earnest. Ottoman engineers dug deep trenches, their artillery positioned to pound Vienna's bastions day and night. Miners tunneled beneath the walls, planting explosives to shatter the city's defenses. Kara Mustafa was patient and calculating. He did not see glory in a single reckless assault. Instead, he relied on slow suffocation, confident that starvation and fear would do his work for him. Inside the city, life quickly became unbearable. Food supplies dwindled, bread was rationed, and clean water grew scarce after the Danube was cut off. Disease festered in the crowded quarters where civilians huddled in cellars and churches, sheltering from the constant bombardment. Yet, under Count Starhemberg's unyielding leadership, morale refused to collapse. The commander swore Vienna would never surrender, and his determination infected soldiers and civilians alike. Whenever the Ottomans advanced, the defenders struck back with surprising ferocity. Sorties erupted from the gates at night, burning siege works, destroying tunnels, and harassing enemy sappers. Even women and children joined the effort, hauling stones, water, and ammunition to the ramparts, fighting side by side with men. The city, battered but unbroken, became a symbol of collective defiance. For nearly 2 months, the defenders resisted wave after wave of Ottoman attacks. Mines exploded beneath towers, collapsing bastions into rubble, but each gap was swiftly filled with timber, earth, and human sacrifice. Every breach was patched with whatever could be found: stone, wood, even the bodies of the fallen. Vienna's defenders seemed possessed by a grim resolve. If the walls fell, they would become the walls themselves. Still, Kara Mustafa believed time was his ally. He tightened the noose around Vienna, certain that hunger would triumph where cannons had not. Yet while the city suffered, the cry for help had not gone unheard. Across Europe, word of Vienna's plight spread like wildfire. Each thunderous Ottoman cannon blast was echoed in the prayers and fears of distant kingdoms. Desperate dispatches slipped through enemy lines, pleading, "Help us, or Europe will fall." For Emperor Leopold I, safe in his refuge at Linz, the consequences were stark. If Vienna fell, the road into the Habsburg heartlands lay open. From there, the Ottoman tide could sweep into the Holy Roman Empire itself. He sent frantic appeals to dukes, princes, and kings, begging them to rally. At first, the response was hesitant. Christendom had often failed to unite against the Ottoman threat, distracted by rivalry and mistrust. Yet this time, something shifted. From Rome, Pope Innocent XI saw the siege as more than politics. It was a holy struggle. He declared that the defense of Vienna was the defense of all Christendom. With diplomacy, persuasion, and the promise of financial support, he pressed rulers to set aside quarrels and join a new crusade. And his greatest triumph was convincing a Polish king, a warrior already legendary for his victories, to march to Vienna's aid. The man who answered Christendom's desperate call was no ordinary monarch. John III Sobieski, King of Poland, was already renowned across Europe as both a brilliant strategist and a warrior king. A decade earlier, he had crushed Ottoman and Tatar forces at the Battle of Khotan, earning the loyalty of his men and the respect of his enemies. Unlike rulers who watched battles from gilded tents, Sobieski fought in the saddle, shoulder to shoulder with his soldiers. To them, he was not just a king. He was a commander worth following into fire. When the appeal for help reached Krakow, hesitation rippled among Poland's nobility. Many feared leaving their homeland exposed, worried that enemies to the east might seize the opportunity to strike. But Sobieski silenced their doubts with words as sharp as any blade. To save Vienna is to save Poland. If Vienna falls, Warsaw will be next. Better to meet them there than to let them come to our soil. His resolve left no room for debate. Thus began one of history's most remarkable mobilizations. The Pope's diplomacy had also borne fruit elsewhere. The Holy Roman Empire, fragmented though it was, pledged forces. Contingents from Bavaria, Saxony, Franconia, and Swabia prepared to march. The Holy League was born, not out of unity, but out of necessity. Old rivalries simmered, languages clashed, and generals argued over precedence. Yet under the shadow of Vienna's impending fall, the coalition endured. By early September, Sobieski and his army crossed into Austria. Around 70,000 men marched with him: Poles, Austrians, Bavarians, Saxons, and German contingents, a patchwork of Christendom bound together by desperation. The march was brutal, the terrain unforgiving, yet each step brought them closer to the city whose fall would mean Europe's ruin. On September 10th, the Allied army climbed into the hills overlooking Vienna. Exhausted but unbroken, they gazed down upon the scene below. Spread across the plains was the Ottoman host, a vast encampment of shimmering tents, siege lines, and smoke from constant bombardment. Beyond it, Vienna's scarred walls still held, though battered and blackened. The city had endured long enough. Now, The fate of Europe would no longer rest on crumbling bastions, but on open battle. At dawn on September 12, 1683, the hills around Vienna stirred with life. The woods and fields that had echoed with cannon fire for 2 long months now braced for something even greater, the collision of 2 colossal armies. One fought for conquest, the other for survival. Below, the crescent banners of the Ottoman Empire snapped in the wind, their sprawling camp like a second city of silk and smoke. Above, hidden among the ridges, the crosses of Christendom marked the gathering of the relief force. The siege was ending. The hour of battle had come. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha remained confident. His army was immense, perhaps 120,000 strong, hardened by discipline and tradition. Janissaries formed the backbone, supported by Sabahi cavalry and fierce auxiliaries from across the empire. His siege lines pressed tight against Vienna, and the defenders were nearing collapse. When word reached him that a Christian relief force approached, he did not tremble. He believed his strength sufficient to both strangle Vienna and crush any army daring to challenge him. But confidence can blind. He underestimated the fury of Vienna's defenders and the cunning of the Polish king now overlooking his camp. From the high ground of the Kahlenberg Ridge, King Sobieski surveyed the battlefield. Before him stretched a vast panorama. To the east, Vienna, its walls shattered and blackened by bombardment. To the south, the glittering Ottoman camp sprawling across the plains. Time was running out. Each hour risked the city's collapse. Yet Sobieski also knew the haste could undo the fragile alliance. He summoned his commanders, men from lands long divided by pride and quarrels. His words cut through centuries of rivalry. Today we fight not for crowns or borders, but for our faith, our families, and the survival of Europe itself. The men roared their approval. The plan was set. The Allied army would sweep down from the wooded hills, pressing the Ottoman flanks and driving toward the city. Meanwhile, Sobieski prepared his most formidable weapon, the greatest cavalry strike Europe had ever witnessed. The battlefield was treacherous. To the north, thick woods slowed the Imperial and German troops as they advanced, clashing with Ottoman outposts. To the east, the Janissaries clung to their siege works, drums pounding, war cries echoing. In the center, Bavarian and Saxon contingents struggled forward through uneven ground. And to the right, hidden among the ridges, Sobieski concealed his 20,000 Polish cavalry, his hammer waiting for the moment when the enemy lines would crack. By midday, battle raged across the field. Cannon fire shook the earth, smoke rising in choking clouds. Muskets roared in volleys, men fell in heaps, and steel clashed in brutal melee. From within Vienna, the defenders, half-starved and wounded, launched desperate sorties against the Ottoman trenches, setting fires and drawing enemy troops away from the main fight. Slowly, the Allies pressed forward. The Ottomans resisted fiercely, but each charge, each counterattack drained their strength. Kara Mustafa threw more and more troops into the fray, but the tide was shifting. By late afternoon, the moment Sobieski had waited for finally arrived. As the sun sank low over the Viennese plains, the Ottoman lines began to falter. Hours of relentless fighting had stretched their forces thin. The Janissaries still held firm near the city walls, but elsewhere their flanks bent under the Allied assault. Kara Mustafa's confidence, so unshakable in the morning, was eroding with every passing hour. High on the slopes of the Kahlenberg, King John III Sobieski saw his chance. The moment had come for the decisive blow. Behind him waited nearly 20,000 horsemen, the largest cavalry force ever assembled in Europe. Among them rode the Polish Hussars, legends in steel and feather. Their armor gleamed in the fading light, their long lances poised for the strike. But it was their wings, great wooden frames adorned with eagle feathers rising from their saddles, that gave them their terrifying presence. In the wind, the feathers rattled with a ghostly hiss, a sound that unnerved enemies and inspired awe among allies. To friend and foe alike, the Hussars seemed less like men and more like avenging angels. Sobieski placed himself at the very tip of the spear. Few monarchs in history would dare to lead such a charge, but Sobieski was no distant ruler. He was a warrior king, ready to gamble everything alongside his men. Raising his sword, he gave the command, "In the name of God and the Blessed Virgin, charge for Vienna, charge for Poland, charge for Christendom." The trumpets blared. The ground shook. From the ridges of the Kahlenberg, the thunder of hooves rose like an oncoming storm. Dust billowed into the air, sunlight flashing off lances and sabers as the massive wave of cavalry hurtled downhill. The Ottomans, locked in battle with the Allied infantry, turned in shock at the sight. They had never expected a cavalry strike of this magnitude. Panic spread as Kara Mustafa's soldiers scrambled to form defenses, but it was too late. The Hussars crashed into the Ottoman lines with the force of a thunderbolt. The impact shattered ranks of Sipahi cavalry, scattering them like leaves in a gale. Infantry formations broke apart, trampled beneath hooves, or cut down by sabers flashing with merciless precision. The charge did not stop. Wave after wave of Allied cavalry, Poles, Austrians, Germans, poured into the breach, their momentum unstoppable. The Ottoman camp, once so orderly, dissolved into chaos. Sobieski himself cut a path straight toward the Grand Vizier's command post. Seeing the tide of disaster sweeping over his army, Kara Mustafa abandoned the field in haste. His proud host, the mightiest army Europe had seen in a century, crumbled around him. From the walls of Vienna, the starving defenders looked on in awe. They saw the winged horsemen driving through the Ottoman camp, scattering the enemy like a flock of startled birds. Cheers erupted across the city. Against all odds, Vienna had been saved. The siege was broken, and with it, the dream of Ottoman conquest in Central Europe. What began as a proud siege ended in catastrophe. As the Polish Hussars carved through the Ottoman camp, panic rippled outward faster than any order could contain it. Units that had held their ground for hours now broke in terror, fleeing in all directions. The once disciplined ranks of Kara Mustafa's army dissolved into chaos. Sipahi cavalry scattered across the plains, their formations shattered beyond repair. Infantry units tried desperately to regroup, but every attempt was smashed apart by Allied cavalry pouring into the gaps. Even the fierce Tatar horsemen, who had struck fear across Europe for generations, now rode in aimless retreat. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa fled in disarray, his command structure collapsing with him. Messengers failed to deliver orders. Trumpets were drowned by the roar of hooves, and panic spread like wildfire. Soldiers, once so steadfast, turned their weapons on one another in the frenzy of escape. From the city walls, Vienna's exhausted defenders could hardly believe their eyes. They had endured 2 months of bombardment, starvation, and despair, and now they watched their tormentors scatter like frightened prey. Cheers rang out, echoing across the battered streets, as citizens and soldiers realized the impossible. Vienna had not fallen. The Allies pressed their advantage without hesitation. Sobieski's cavalry chased fleeing Ottomans across the plains, cutting down stragglers and capturing abandoned artillery. Every road and river crossing became a trap. What had started as an orderly withdrawal collapsed into a desperate rout. The Ottoman camp, once a glittering city of silk and banners, was reduced to plunder. Tents, cannons, and vast stores of supplies were left behind in the scramble to escape. In a single evening, an army that had marched with confidence toward the heart of Europe disintegrated into ruin. Sobieski's strategy had worked to perfection. By holding his cavalry in reserve until the enemy was stretched and weary, he struck at the precise moment when the blow would be fatal. His patience had turned the siege into a slaughter, his charge into legend. For the Ottomans, the defeat was more than a lost battle. It was the collapse of their dream of conquering Central Europe. As dusk settled over the plains, the truth was undeniable. Vienna had been saved. The enemy who had thundered at its gates for 2 long months was now in full retreat, abandoning cannons, banners, and supplies in their desperate flight eastward. Within the city walls, relief erupted into jubilation. The defenders, gaunt with hunger and exhaustion, climbed the ruined bastions to watch the miracle unfold. They had endured starvation, disease, and constant bombardment, yet they now stood victorious. The winged horsemen of Poland had arrived like avenging angels, and the nightmare was over. When Sobieski and the Allied commanders entered Vienna, they were greeted as saviors. The line of Poland rode through streets still scarred by fire and rubble, yet lined with cheering crowds. Soldiers of the Holy League marched behind him, their torn banners held high as citizens showered them with flowers and blessings. Bells rang out from churches across the city, their peals rising into the night sky in thanksgiving. For the people of Vienna, the victory was more than survival. It was resurrection. The walls that had seemed ready to collapse now stood as symbols of endurance. Stories of heroism spread swiftly. Women who carried stones to the ramparts, children who ferried water under fire, soldiers who fought until their last breath. These tales, mingling with awe at the Hussars' charge, created a legend that would be told for centuries. Feasts were prepared, prayers offered, and medals distributed to honor the courage of both defenders and allies. Though weary from battle, the people of Vienna celebrated with a fervor that only those who had looked death in the eye could understand. Yet beneath the joy was a sober recognition of cost. Thousands had fallen, Ottoman and Christian alike, and the city itself bore deep scars. Homes lay in ruins, fortifications were shattered, and the economy disrupted by months of siege. Still, as night deepened and the bells of victory rang, one truth burned brighter than all others. Vienna still stood. With the siege broken and the enemy scattered, Vienna turned from survival to restoration. The scars of war were everywhere. Bastions reduced to rubble, homes charred, markets deserted, and farmlands trampled beneath the weight of armies. Yet the spirit of the city had not been extinguished. Almost immediately, work began. Skilled masons and carpenters moved to repair the shattered walls. Bridges and gates were rebuilt to restore security. Farmers returned to their fields, coaxing life back into soil scarred by siege trenches. Merchants reopened stalls in the markets, bringing bread, cloth, and spices from across Europe, as Vienna sought to heal its wounded economy. Churches rang with both prayers of thanksgiving and solemn requiems for the fallen. Memorials rose to honor the defenders who had given their lives, ensuring their sacrifice would never be forgotten. But the impact of the battle was not confined to Vienna's streets. Across Europe, the victory sent shockwaves. The Holy League, that fragile coalition of Poles, Austrians, Bavarians, Saxons, and more, had proven the unthinkable, that unity could halt the Ottoman advance. The alliance, born of desperation, was now a symbol of strength. Diplomatic ties deepened. Monarchs and princes who had once hesitated now sent words of praise and promises of support. Pope Innocent XI hailed the victory as divine providence, proof that faith and courage could triumph even against overwhelming odds. For King John III Sobieski, glory was immortal. To his soldiers, he remained a comrade in arms, the warrior king who had charged at their head. To Europe, he became the savior of Christendom, a living legend whose leadership had preserved the continent's heart. Yet Sobieski himself knew that victory was only the beginning. The Ottoman Empire, though wounded, remained vast and formidable. More battles lay ahead. But for now, Vienna was safe, and the tide of history had turned. Though Vienna rejoiced, the cost of salvation was written in blood and ash. The plains surrounding the city were littered with the fallen, thousands of Ottoman soldiers cut down in retreat, and countless Christian warriors who had given their lives in defense of the walls. Even within Vienna, families mourned loved ones lost to hunger, disease, or bombardment. The triumph was undeniable, but it carried a shadow. Survivors whispered stories of narrow escapes, of comrades who stood firm at the barricades until the last breath, of civilians who risked their lives carrying water and stone to the ramparts. These tales became part of the city's soul, etched into tavern songs, family prayers, and church sermons. Vienna's defenders were hailed as heroes. The ragged citizen militia who had stood beside professional soldiers were honored with gratitude. Women who had carried supplies under fire were remembered with reverence. Children who had braved bombardment to ferry messages were celebrated as symbols of courage. Every act of sacrifice, large or small, became part of the legend of the siege. Sobieski, though lauded as the architect of victory, gave credit to his allies and to divine providence. His discipline ensured that plunder was kept to a minimum, his men focusing instead on pursuit and neutralization. Such restraint preserved Vienna from further ruin and underscored the battle's moral weight. This was not a conquest, but a deliverance. In the months that followed, the memory of the siege hardened into a lesson. Vienna had shown that even the mightiest empire could be resisted if unity, resolve, and faith held firm. The victory restored morale across Christendom, proving that the Ottoman advance was not unstoppable. Yet remembrance carried both pride and grief. Bells tolled for the dead, prayers rose for the wounded, and memorials were erected in churches and squares. The citizens of Vienna would forever recall not only the thunder of the Hussars' charge, but also the long nights of hunger, fear, and endurance that had preceded salvation. The price had been steep, but in paying it, Vienna, and with it, Europe, endured. By the time winter's chill settled over Central Europe, Vienna had already begun to rise from its ruins. Fortifications were rebuilt, markets reopened, and life slowly returned to the streets that only months earlier had echoed with cannon fire. The siege, once a nightmare of hunger and despair, transformed into a story of resilience and rebirth. But the significance of Vienna's salvation stretched far beyond the city walls. The victory of September 1683 marked a decisive turning point in European history. The Ottoman Empire, once seen as an unstoppable force sweeping into the continent, had been halted. Its defeat shattered the illusion of inevitability and shifted the balance of power. No longer was Europe merely defending itself. Now it stood ready to push back. The Holy League, forged under pressure and sustained by desperation, emerged strengthened. Bonds between Poland, Austria, and the German states deepened, proving that fractured Christendom could unite when the stakes demanded it. Diplomats and monarchs across the continent recognized that the salvation of Vienna had preserved not just a city, but the cultural and political heart of Europe. For King John III Sobieski, his charge into legend was complete. His name joined the pantheon of Europe's great commanders, remembered not only for tactical brilliance, but for courage, humility, and faith. In art, song, and memory, the image of the Winged Hussars descending from the Kahlenberg became immortal, a symbol of salvation, unity, and defiance against impossible odds. For the people of Vienna, the battle became both a wound and a source of pride. Every rebuilt wall, every church bell, every tale told by survivors carried the memory of sacrifice. Generations would grow up knowing that when all seemed lost, courage and unity had prevailed. The echoes of the battle resonated across centuries. Vienna's victory reminded Europe of what could be achieved when divided nations stood together. It shaped diplomacy, warfare, and culture, leaving an imprint that endured long after the smoke cleared. What began as a desperate defense against siege became more than a military triumph. It was the salvation of a continent, the rebirth of hope, and the proof that even in the darkest hour, history could be changed by courage. And so, the Battle of Vienna stands not only as the moment when a city was saved, but when the course of Europe itself was forever altered.